Hello everyone, it's me Jacob, your storyteller for tonight. In our previous journey together, we followed David from his humble beginnings as a shepherd boy to his rise as Israel's greatest king. We watched him learn courage in the wilderness, develop his faith through trials, and eventually claim the throne that God had promised him. But becoming king was only the beginning of David's story. Tonight, we're continuing with one of the most beautiful chapters in David's reign. This is about David and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, David's closest friend who had died in battle. Mephibosheth was disabled, living in poverty, hiding in exile because he believed the new king would kill him to eliminate any threats to the throne. That's how royal transitions usually worked in the ancient world. But David was different. Instead of hunting down his enemies' families, he asked a simple question: is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? That question would change everything for a forgotten prince who had been living in fear for years. We'll walk with both men through this story of unexpected grace. We'll see Mephibosheth's terror at being summoned to the palace, his amazement at receiving kindness instead of death, and David's demonstration of what it means to keep a promise even when no one would hold you accountable for breaking it. So get comfortable, take a deep breath, and if you enjoy these peaceful journeys through ancient stories, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more. Let's begin in David's palace, where a king is about to show the world what grace looks like. King David sat in his palace in Jerusalem, surrounded by the wealth and power that came with ruling a united Israel. The kingdom was at peace. His enemies were subdued, and his reign was secure. The shepherd boy who had once hidden in caves was now the most powerful man in the ancient Near East, commanding armies, ruling tribes, and enjoying prosperity beyond anything his family could have imagined. But on this particular day, in the midst of all his success, David's mind wandered to the past. Perhaps it was triggered by a song, a familiar melody that reminded him of simpler times. Maybe it was the sight of young men training in his courtyard, their friendship reminding him of bonds he had once shared. Or it could have been simply the quiet moment that kings rarely experience, when the weight of responsibilities lifts briefly and memories surface unbidden, whatever prompted it. David found himself thinking about Jonathan, his dearest friend, the prince who had loved him more than his own life, the man who had protected him when his own father wanted him dead. Jonathan had been everything a friend should be: loyal, generous, faithful, willing to sacrifice his own future for David's welfare. The memories came flooding back. Jonathan stripping off his royal robe and giving it to David, their secret meetings in the wilderness, the covenant they had sworn together, the tears they had shed when they realized their friendship was putting both their lives in danger. Jonathan had been more than a friend. He had been a brother, a companion whose loss still ached even after all these years. David remembered their last meeting, when Jonathan had helped him escape from Saul's final attempt at murder. They had kissed each other goodbye, wept together, and renewed their covenant, not just between themselves, but between their families, their descendants, their future generations. May the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever, Jonathan had said. That covenant had been sealed not with political calculation but with genuine love. Two young men promising to care for each other's families, to show kindness to each other's children, to maintain loyalty even beyond death. It was the kind of promise that friends make when they're young and idealistic, when love seems stronger than politics, when honour matters more than advantage. But now Jonathan was dead, killed alongside his father Saul in the disastrous battle at Mount Gilboa. David had mourned them both, composing a lament that captured his genuine grief. How the mighty have fallen, he had sung, honouring both the king who had tried to kill him and the friend who had saved his life. In the years since then, David had been busy consolidating his kingdom, fighting wars, establishing his capital, organising his government. The practical demands of ruling had left little time for reflection, for remembering, for considering what obligations from the past might still need to be fulfilled. But today, in this quiet moment, David found himself wondering about that covenant with Jonathan. Had he honoured it? Had he fulfilled his promises? Had he shown the kind of loyalty to Jonathan's memory that Jonathan had shown to him in life? The question that formed in David's mind was both simple and profound. Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? It wasn't the kind of question that most kings asked. Usually, new rulers eliminated potential rivals, destroyed the families of their predecessors, secured their thrones by removing any possible challenges to their authority. David's advisors might have questioned the wisdom of seeking out Saul's descendants. Why risk complications? Why create potential problems? Why not let sleeping dogs lie? The house of Saul had been hostile to David, had hunted him, had tried repeatedly to destroy him. Most people would consider any debt to that family fully paid, but David wasn't thinking like a politician. He was remembering like a friend. The covenant with Jonathan transcended the conflict with Saul. Love was stronger than politics. Honour mattered more than security. Some promises were meant to be kept regardless of changing circumstances, regardless of personal cost, regardless of practical considerations. The king who had learned loyalty in shepherds' fields, who had been shaped by years of depending on God's faithfulness, who had experienced grace when he deserved judgment, understood that kindness was not a weakness, but a strength. Showing mercy was not naive, but noble. Keeping promises was not foolish, but fundamental to character. David's question revealed the heart that had made God choose him as king. This was why Samuel had anointed a shepherd boy instead of an impressive warrior. Why God had looked beyond outward appearance to inner character. Why the man after God's own heart had been found among sheep rather than in palaces. David's instinct was toward kindness, toward faithfulness, toward grace. The palace servants who heard David's question probably exchanged glances. It was unusual, unexpected, potentially dangerous. Kings typically asked about enemies to be eliminated, not descendants to be blessed. But they had learned to trust their king's judgment, to follow his leadership, to carry out his commands even when they didn't fully understand his motivations. The search would begin immediately. Word would go out throughout the kingdom. Inquiries would be made, old servants would be questioned, records would be examined. Someone, somewhere, knew whether any of Saul's family had survived the political upheavals, the battles, the years of uncertainty that had followed the old king's death. But David already knew that this search was about more than fulfilling an old obligation. It was about demonstrating the kind of king he wanted to be, the kind of character he wanted to display, the kind of legacy he wanted to leave. In a world where power was usually used for personal advantage, David was choosing to use his authority for someone else's benefit. This question, asked in a quiet moment of reflection, would soon set in motion events that would transform at least one life and possibly demonstrate to watching nations what it looked like when earthly rulers reflected heavenly character, when human kings chose to act like the divine king, when grace was given not because it was earned, but because it was promised. The shepherd who had learned to protect sheep was about to extend that protection to someone who had every reason to fear him, someone who had been hiding in the shadows, someone who believed that discovery meant death. David's question was about to become someone else's salvation, though neither of them knew it yet. The summons comes to Ziba early in the morning, while dew still clings to the olive trees and the city of Jerusalem is just beginning to stir. He's an older man now, his hair silver with years, his hands weathered from a lifetime of service. Once, he had served in the household of King Saul, managing estates and overseeing servants in the grand palace that had been the centre of Israel's power. But those days feel like a distant dream, faded like morning mist in the heat of the sun. When Saul's dynasty fell, when the king and his sons died on Mount Gilboa, Ziba's world crumbled with it. Servants of fallen kings rarely fared well in ancient times. They were often viewed with suspicion, their loyalties questioned, their futures uncertain. Many of Saul's former household had scattered like leaves in the wind, seeking new masters or simply trying to disappear into the anonymity of common life. But Ziba had survived. He had adapted, learned to navigate the changing political landscape with the wisdom that comes from watching kingdoms rise and fall. He had kept his head down, his ears open, and his memories carefully guarded. In a world where yesterday's friend could become tomorrow's enemy, discretion was more valuable than gold. Now, as he makes his way through the familiar streets toward David's palace, Ziba's mind races with possibilities. Why would the king summon him? What could David want with a former servant of Saul's house? The practical part of his mind whispers warnings, reminding him that royal summons could lead to honour or execution with equal ease. But another part of him, a part shaped by years of observing the character of men, senses that this might be different. David's reputation had grown over the years, not just as a warrior and king, but as a man of unusual mercy. There were stories, whispered in marketplaces and shared around evening fires, of David's refusal to harm Saul even when he had the chance, of his mourning for enemies who had shown him no kindness, of his protection of the weak and his care for those whom others might overlook. Still, as Ziba approaches the palace gates, his heart beats faster. The architecture here is different from Saul's palace, simpler in some ways, less concerned with intimidating visitors and more focused on welcoming them. But it's still the seat of power, still the place where decisions are made that can change lives in an instant. The guards know him, or at least know of him. Word travels fast in the circles of power. And Ziba's connection to Saul's household has never been entirely secret. They escort him through corridors lined with cedar wood, past windows that frame views of the city David has made his capital. Everything feels both familiar and foreign. The rhythms of palace life unchanged even as the faces and voices have shifted. When he finally stands before David, Ziba is struck by the king's presence. This isn't the intimidating figure he had expected, but neither is it weakness disguised as kindness. David's eyes are clear and direct, holding both authority and something else, something that looks remarkably like genuine concern. The king's question, when it comes, is simple and straightforward. "Are you Ziba?" "I am your servant." Ziba replies, using the ancient formula of respect that acknowledges both hierarchy and submission. But David's response surprises him. There's no lengthy preamble, no careful manoeuvring around the real purpose of this meeting. Instead, David cuts straight to the heart of what he wants to know. Is there not still someone of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him? The kindness of God. Those words hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Ziba is still processing. Not political kindness, not strategic mercy, but the kindness of God. As if the Almighty himself were asking the question, as if divine grace were seeking an outlet through a human heart. Ziba's mind immediately goes to Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, the boy who had been crippled in the chaos following Saul's death. He had kept track of the young man over the years, not out of any particular loyalty or affection, but because information was valuable, and knowing the whereabouts of Saul's surviving family members seemed like the kind of knowledge that might someday prove useful. But he hesitates before answering. Years of navigating royal courts have taught him to be careful with information. He needs to understand David's intentions, to gauge whether this question springs from mercy or suspicion. His response, when it finally comes, is measured, testing the waters of the king's true purpose. There is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet. He watches David's face carefully as he speaks, looking for any sign of threat or calculation. But what he sees instead is something that takes him completely by surprise. David's expression softens, and for just a moment, the king looks not like a ruler interrogating a subject, but like a man remembering a beloved friend. The mention of Jonathan's name has clearly touched something deep in David's heart, something tender and protective. "Where is he?" David asks. And now Ziba can hear the eagerness in his voice. This isn't the tone of a man planning harm. This is the voice of someone who has just discovered an opportunity to honour a debt of love. He is in the house of Mashir, the son of Amiel, in Lo-debar. Ziba answers, and as the words leave his lips, he realizes he may have just changed the course of a young man's life. Lo-debar, that desolate place, that land of no pasture where the forgotten go to disappear. But perhaps, if he's reading David's heart correctly, Mephibosheth's days in the wilderness are about to end. The king nods slowly, already making plans, already seeing possibilities that Ziba can only guess at, and as the morning sun climbs higher over Jerusalem, casting new light into the palace chambers, two men part ways with very different understanding of what has just transpired. Ziba returns to his life, wondering what consequences his information might bring. And David begins to set in motion the machinery of grace. preparing to fulfill a promise made years ago to a friend who would never see its completion. Far from the marble halls and cedar chambers of David's palace, in a place where hope goes to wither and die, a man wakes to another day of quiet desperation. Lo-Debar stretches before him like a wasteland, its very name a mockery of the dreams he once dared to hold. The place of no pasture, they call it, and the description fits more than just the barren landscape. Mephibosheth struggles to sit up, his damaged legs protesting the movement as they do every morning, every evening, every moment of every day since that terrible fall so many years ago. He was just 5 years old when his world collapsed. When the news came that his grandfather Saul and his beloved father Jonathan had died in battle. When his nurse grabbed him up in panicked flight from the palace. When her trembling hands lost their grip and sent him tumbling to the ground. His feet crushed beneath his own small body. Now, at 30-something, he has learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for someone like him. His hands have grown strong from compensating for legs that will never carry him properly. His arms bear the scars of countless falls, countless struggles to move from place to place in a society that sees his disability as a curse, perhaps even as judgment from God for the sins of his family. The house where he lives isn't really his, though Machir, son of Amiel, has been kind enough to let him stay. Machir is one of those rare souls who sees suffering and responds with compassion rather than suspicion. He has provided shelter, basic food, protection from those who might wish harm to the surviving remnant of Saul's lineage. But charity, even generous charity, carries its own weight. Mephibosheth knows he is a burden, a mouth to feed who contributes little in return, a liability that could bring danger to his host if the wrong people ask the wrong questions. His days are filled with small tasks, things he can manage from a seated position or with the aid of crutches carved from olive wood. He mends nets, sorts grain, helps with accounts when his literacy proves useful, the skills he learned as a child in the palace, reading and writing, mathematics and languages. These have become tools for survival rather than preparation for leadership. He is educated poverty, royal blood flowing in veins that will never again know royal privilege. But perhaps the heaviest burden Mephibosheth carries isn't physical. It's the weight of memory and fear, memory of who he used to be or who he might have been, the grandson of a king, the son of a prince, heir to promises that died with his father on Mount Gilboa, and fear, constant fear, that someday David's soldiers will come looking for loose ends, for potential threats to the new dynasty, for princes who might rally opposition against the shepherd boy who now wears Israel's crown. In the long evenings, when the work is done and the household settles into the quiet rhythms of rest, Mephibosheth often finds himself staring into the darkness, wondering about the life that might have been. Would Jonathan have been a good king? Would he have ruled with the same fierce loyalty that had marked his friendship with David? Would he have taught his son the arts of war and diplomacy, prepared him to inherit not just a throne but the wisdom to occupy it well? These thoughts are both comfort and torment. They connect him to a past that feels increasingly unreal, but they also highlight the vast distance between who he was meant to be and who he has become. A prince reduced to poverty, a potential king living on scraps of charity. A young man whose royal bloodline seems more like a death sentence than a blessing. His wife sleeps beside him, a woman who married him knowing full well that their children would inherit not wealth or status, but the same dangerous legacy that haunts their father. She has never complained, never expressed regret for choosing love over security, but Mephibosheth sees the lines of worry around her eyes, understands the sacrifices she makes daily, knows that every knock at the door might be the one that brings soldiers rather than neighbours. Their son, his son, plays in the dust outside their simple dwelling, unaware that his grandfather was once heir to a throne, unaware that his bloodline carries both nobility and peril in equal measure. Sometimes Mephibosheth watches the boy run on legs that work perfectly, and his heart fills with a mixture of joy and sorrow so profound it takes his breath away. Joy that his son will never know the physical limitations that define his own existence. Sorrow that the child will grow up in poverty, in exile, in the shadow of a family history that offers more danger than honour. The local people treat them with a mixture of kindness and caution. Everyone knows who Mephibosheth is, knows the story of his fall, knows the weight of history he carries. Some offer help out of genuine compassion, others out of a superstitious belief that showing kindness to fallen royalty might somehow bring blessing. A few keep their distance, worried that association with Saul's family might invite unwanted attention from David's government. And so the days pass, one blending into another like water flowing over stones, wearing smooth the sharp edges of dreams and ambitions. Mephibosheth has learned to find contentment, or at least acceptance, in this quiet life of limitation. He has discovered that happiness doesn't require a throne, that love can flourish in a hut as easily as in a palace, that dignity isn't dependent on the ability to walk without assistance. But late at night, when sleep eludes him and the weight of his twisted legs reminds him of all he has lost, he sometimes allows himself to wonder. Does anyone in Jerusalem remember Jonathan's son? Does anyone care that Saul's grandson still draws breath in this forgotten corner of the kingdom? And perhaps most dangerous of all, does King David ever think about the promises made and the debt still owed? Or has the business of ruling crowded out the memory of friendship? Tomorrow will bring another day in Lo-Debar, another sunrise over the place of no pasture. But tonight, as Mephibosheth finally surrenders to sleep, he has no idea that his name has already been spoken in the king's presence, that his location has been revealed, that grace is preparing to shatter the walls of his exile like dawn breaking over the desert. Change is coming, carried on the feet of messengers who will arrive with words that will sound too good to be true. Because sometimes the most beautiful truths are the ones we never dared to hope for. Let's step back in time together. Back to a day when the world was simpler for a little boy who had no idea his life was about to be torn apart. It was an ordinary day in King Saul's palace. The kind of day that begins with sunlight streaming through windows and the familiar sounds of servants going about their morning duties. The kind of day that becomes unforgettable only because of what happens next. Mephibosheth was 5 years old, running through those grand palace corridors with the boundless energy that belongs to children who feel completely safe in their world. His little feet moved quickly across polished stone floors, his laughter echoing off high ceilings as he played whatever games 5-year-olds invent when they have an entire palace as their playground. His nurse watched him with the mixture of affection and gentle exasperation that comes from caring for an active child. She had been with him since birth. This woman who loved him like her own son, always ready to catch him if he stumbled, always there with a gentle word or a comforting embrace when the world seemed too big or too confusing. The palace in those days was a place of routine and security. Servants knew their duties and performed them with quiet efficiency. Guards stood at their posts with the calm confidence of men protecting a stable kingdom. And life moved with the predictable rhythms that come when all seems well with the world. Mephibosheth's days were filled with the simple joys of childhood, lessons from patient teachers who understood how to make learning feel like play, stories told by his nurse during quiet afternoon hours, and visits from his father Jonathan when royal duties allowed time for the precious moments between father and son. It was a protected life, a childhood wrapped in love and security, the kind of upbringing that should have stretched on for years without interruption, preparing a young prince gradually for the responsibilities that would someday be his. But on this particular day, a messenger arrived at the palace gates, dusty from hard riding, his face bearing the kind of expression that makes your heart sink before he even opens his mouth. He carried news that would shatter the peace of the palace like a stone thrown through glass. News that would change everything for everyone, but especially for one little boy who was playing somewhere in those familiar corridors. King Saul was dead, Prince Jonathan was dead, and the Philistines had won a victory so decisive that it would reshape the political landscape of Israel forever. The dynasty that had seemed so secure, the future that had seemed so certain, all of it was gone in a single day of battle on Mount Gilboa. When word began to spread through the palace, you could feel the change in the very air. The confident voices of servants became whispered conversations. The steady footsteps of guards became hurried movements. And the atmosphere of security was replaced by something that felt very much like fear. You see, in the ancient world, when a dynasty fell, the consequences were swift and often brutal. New kings didn't typically allow potential rivals to survive, especially not the sons and grandsons of the previous ruler. It was harsh politics, but it was the reality of how power changed hands in those days. Mephibosheth's nurse understood this danger immediately. She had served in the palace long enough to know how these transitions worked, how quickly celebration for some could become tragedy for others. Her first thought, her only thought, was to get the boy she loved to safety before it was too late. So she found little Mephibosheth wherever he was playing, probably interrupting some game or adventure that had captured his 5-year-old imagination, and she scooped him up in her arms with the urgent gentleness of someone trying to save a life without causing panic. "We have to go now," she probably told him, trying to keep her voice calm while her heart raced with fear. 5-year-olds don't understand palace politics or dynastic succession. They just know when the adults around them are frightened, and they trust those adults to keep them safe. Picture her, this woman who had cared for him since birth, trying to move quickly through corridors that were no longer safe, carrying a confused child who didn't understand why they were suddenly leaving everything familiar behind. She was driven by love, by the fierce protective instinct that makes ordinary people capable of extraordinary courage when someone they care about is in danger. The palace that had been their refuge was now their trap. Every moment they remained increased the risk. Every corridor they travelled might bring them face to face with soldiers or officials who would see in little Mephibosheth not a child to be protected but a threat to be eliminated. But love and urgency, as powerful as they are, can make people clumsy. Fear has a way of affecting coordination, of making familiar paths feel treacherous, of turning routine movements into dangerous mistakes. And so, somewhere in that desperate flight through the palace, whether she was looking over her shoulder for pursuit or trying to move too quickly down steps that were safe in calm moments but hazardous when taken in panic, Mephibosheth's nurse stumbled. In that terrible instant, as she felt herself falling, she lost her grip on the precious child she was trying to save. Little Mephibosheth tumbled from her arms, his small body hitting the stone floor with an impact that would echo through the rest of his life. The injury was severe. Both of his feet were crushed, bones shattered, tendons damaged beyond repair, the kind of wound that in those days, without modern medicine or surgical techniques, would mean permanent disability. The boy who had been running through palace corridors just moments before would never walk normally again. But even in that moment of horror, even as she realized what had happened, the nurse's first concern was still his safety. Physical injuries could be treated later, if there was a later, but right now they still had to escape the palace before political enemies arrived. So she gathered up the injured child, probably crying herself as she heard his pain, and continued their flight into an uncertain future. The fall that had damaged his feet was just the beginning of changes that would reshape everything about his life, his identity, his prospects, his place in the world. The boy who should have grown up as a prince, groomed for leadership and responsibility, would instead learn to navigate a world that wasn't built for someone with his limitations. The future that had seemed so bright and certain was now clouded with questions that no one could answer. And yet, in ways that neither he nor his nurse could understand in that moment of crisis, this tragedy was also part of a larger story, a story of grace that would unfold years later when a king named David would ask a simple question about showing kindness to anyone remaining from the house of Saul. The fall that seemed to end everything would actually become the beginning of something beautiful. But that's a story for another day. Tonight, we simply remember a little boy whose world changed in an instant, and a woman who loved him enough to risk everything trying to save him, even when saving him meant watching him fall. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives, the ones that seem to destroy our futures, are actually preparing us for graces we can't yet imagine, stories we haven't yet heard, kindnesses we haven't yet received. Mephibosheth fell that day, but he fell into a story bigger than his own pain, a story where broken feet would not prevent him from finding a place at a king's table, where disability would not disqualify him from experiencing the fullness of royal grace. The little boy who fell in the palace corridor would one day rise to discover that sometimes our greatest limitations become the very reasons we are remembered, not for what we lost, but for what we received when we thought we had nothing left to hope for. The years passed slowly in Lo-Debar, one blending into another like water flowing over stones. wearing smooth the sharp edges of dreams and expectations until what remained was simply the quiet rhythm of survival. The day-to-day business of making a life out of whatever circumstances you've been given. Mephibosheth had grown from that frightened 5-year-old boy into a man, but his world had shrunk considerably from the grand corridors of King Saul's palace to the modest confines of Machir's household in this forgotten corner of the kingdom. Lo-debar, they called it, the place of no pasture, and the name fit more than just the barren landscape. Machir, son of Amiel, was one of those rare souls who sees suffering and responds with compassion rather than suspicion. He had provided shelter when shelter was desperately needed, food when hunger threatened, and perhaps most importantly, protection from those who might wish harm to anyone connected with Saul's fallen dynasty. But charity, even generous charity, carries its own particular weight. Mephibosheth knew he was a burden, a mouth to feed who contributed less than he consumed, a liability that could potentially bring danger to his host's household if the wrong people asked the wrong questions at the wrong time. His days were filled with small tasks, the kinds of things he could manage from a seated position or with the aid of crutches carved from local wood. He mended fishing nets with patient fingers that had learned to find purpose in detailed work. He sorted grain and helped with accounts when his palace education proved useful. He did whatever he could to earn his place in a household that had already shown him more kindness than he had any right to expect. The skills he had learned as a child in the royal court, reading and writing, mathematics and languages, had become tools for basic survival rather than preparation for leadership. He was educated poverty, royal blood flowing in veins that would never again know royal privilege, a prince reduced to whatever work his damaged feet would allow. Think about the weight of that transformation. From a childhood where servants anticipated his every need, to a life where he worked to justify his very presence. From rooms filled with luxury and comfort, to sharing space with people who had shown him kindness, but who also had their own needs, their own struggles, their own reasons to question how long they could support someone who brought more risk than reward. But perhaps the heaviest burden Mephibosheth carried wasn't physical. It was the constant presence of memory and fear, memory of who he used to be, or who he might have been if that terrible day had never come. And fear, the kind of fear that lives in your chest like a cold stone, that someday David's soldiers would come looking for loose ends, for potential threats to the new dynasty, for princes who might rally opposition even from their beds of poverty. The local people treated him with a mixture of kindness and careful distance. Everyone knew who Mephibosheth was, knew the story of his fall, knew the dangerous weight of history he carried on his shoulders. Some offered help out of genuine compassion, others out of a kind of superstitious belief that showing kindness to fallen royalty might somehow bring blessing, or at least avoid a curse. A few kept their distance entirely, worried that association with Saul's family might invite unwanted attention from David's government, might bring the kind of scrutiny that could make life difficult for everyone in their small community. It was practical caution, the kind that keeps ordinary people safe in times when political winds can shift without warning. And so the days passed, each one bringing the same small routines, the same modest tasks, the same quiet acceptance of a life that had been shaped by circumstances beyond his control. Mephibosheth had learned to find a kind of contentment in this existence, or at least the absence of active misery, which was sometimes the best that life offered. His wife, the woman who had chosen to marry him, knowing full well what kind of future she was accepting, never complained about the limitations their life imposed. She had entered into their union understanding that their children would inherit not wealth or status, but the same dangerous legacy that followed their father like a shadow. But Mephibosheth could see the lines of worry around her eyes, could understand the daily calculations she made about resources and risks, could recognize the way she watched the horizon as if expecting trouble to appear at any moment. Love had brought her into his life, but love couldn't eliminate the practical challenges that came with being married to someone whose very existence was a political complication. Their son, his son, played in the dust outside their simple dwelling, unaware that his grandfather had once been heir to a throne, unaware that his bloodline carried both nobility and peril in equal measure. Sometimes Mephibosheth would watch the boy run on legs that worked perfectly, and his heart would fill with a mixture of joy and sorrow so profound it left him breathless. Joy that his child would never know the physical limitations that defined his own existence. Sorrow that the boy would grow up in poverty and exile, in the shadow of a family history that offered more danger than dignity. Pride in his son's strength and energy, grief for all the opportunities that would never come, all the doors that would remain closed simply because of whose grandson he was. In the long evenings, when the day's work was finished and the household settled into the quiet rhythms of rest, Mephibosheth often found himself staring into the darkness and wondering about the life that might have been. Would Jonathan have been a good king if he had survived that battle on Mount Gilboa? Would he have ruled with the same fierce loyalty that had marked his friendship with David? Would he have taught his son the arts of war and diplomacy, prepared him to inherit not just a throne, but the wisdom to occupy it well? These thoughts were both comfort and torment. They connected him to a past that felt increasingly unreal, but they also highlighted the vast distance between who he was meant to be and who he had become. Sometimes, when sleep was elusive and the weight of his twisted legs reminded him of all he had lost, he allowed himself the dangerous luxury of wondering. Did anyone in Jerusalem remember Jonathan's son? Did anyone care that Saul's grandson still drew breath in this forgotten corner of the kingdom? And perhaps most perilous of all, did King David ever think about the promises made to his dearest friend, the covenants sworn in younger days when the future seemed full of possibility? Or had the business of ruling a kingdom crowded out the memory of friendship, leaving old debts unpaid and old promises forgotten? These were the thoughts that visited him in the darkness, the questions that had no answers, the wondering that could lead either to hope or to despair depending on the direction his mind chose to travel. But mostly, Mephibosheth had learned to push such thoughts away, to focus on the present moment, on the work that needed doing, on the family that depended on him. He had discovered something that many people never learn, that happiness doesn't require a throne, that love can flourish in a hut as easily as in a palace, that dignity isn't dependent on the ability to walk without assistance or the possession of political power. But he had also learned that acceptance isn't the same thing as fulfillment, that making peace with your circumstances doesn't eliminate the longing for something more, that contentment can coexist with a deep sense of incompleteness, of possibilities unexplored, of purposes unfulfilled. And so life continued in Lo-Debar, in the place of no pasture. where days blended into months and months into years, where a man who had once been destined for greatness learned to find meaning in small kindnesses, modest achievements, quiet love. Tomorrow would bring another day much like today, another sunrise over the barren landscape, another round of simple tasks and careful economies, another evening of wondering what might have been. But tonight, as Mephibosheth finally surrendered to sleep, he had no idea that his name had already been spoken in the king's presence, that his location had been revealed, that grace was preparing to shatter the walls of his exile like dawn breaking over the desert. Change was coming, carried on the feet of messengers who would arrive with words that would sound too good to be true, because sometimes the most beautiful truths are the ones we never dared to hope for, the ones that find us when we've stopped looking, the ones that transform exile into homecoming without any effort on our part. The place of no pasture was about to become fertile ground for a miracle, but Mephibosheth didn't know that yet, for now he was simply a man learning to sleep despite the weight of broken dreams, trusting that tomorrow would be bearable even if it wouldn't be extraordinary. But sometimes, in the economy of grace, the extraordinary comes disguised as an ordinary day, and the miracle arrives at the moment when we've finally stopped expecting it. The morning started like any other in Lo-Debar, with the familiar sounds of a household stirring to life, the quiet conversations of people going about their daily routines, the gentle noises that mark the transition from sleep to wakefulness in communities where everyone knows their place and their purpose. Mephibosheth woke to the same dull ache in his legs that had greeted him every morning for more years than he cared to count. The persistent reminder of that long-ago fall that had changed the trajectory of his entire life. He moved carefully, as always, shifting his weight with the practiced patience of someone who had learned to work with his body's limitations rather than against them. The sun was already climbing toward its mid-morning position when they appeared. 3 men in travelling clothes, dusty from the road but bearing themselves with the unmistakable authority of those who serve in royal households. They asked questions, made inquiries, and soon everyone in the small community knew why they had come. They were looking for Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, grandson of Saul. Picture the fear that must have shot through him when those words reached his ears. For years, he had lived with the constant awareness that this moment might come, the day when David's government would finally decide to eliminate any remaining threats from Saul's lineage. He had imagined it countless times, but imagination had never quite prepared him for the reality. His wife's face went pale when she heard the news. Her hands trembled as she helped him prepare for what they both assumed would be his final journey. There were no words adequate for this moment, no comfort that could soften the blow of knowing that the life they had built together, modest as it was about to end. His son, still too young to fully understand what was happening, watched with wide eyes as his father prepared to leave with the king's messengers. The boy knew something was wrong, could feel the tension in the air, could see the tears his mother was trying so hard to hide. Mephibosheth held his family close, memorizing the feel of their embrace, the sound of their voices, the way the morning light fell across their faces, if these were to be his last moments with them. He wanted to carry every detail into whatever came next. The messengers were not unkind. But they were also not apologetic. They had their orders, their mission, their timeline to keep. "The king has summoned you," one of them said simply. There was no explanation, no hint of what David's intentions might be. Just the stark reality of royal command that could not be questioned or delayed. Mashir, who had provided refuge for so many years, stood silently by as Mephibosheth prepared for the journey to Jerusalem. What could he say? What comfort could he offer? They all understood what royal summons typically meant for members of deposed dynasties, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. The journey itself was a special kind of torture. Every mile that brought them closer to Jerusalem felt like a mile closer to death. Mephibosheth travelled as best he could, his damaged feet making the trip slow and painful. But the messengers were patient, almost gentle in their assistance when the terrain became too difficult. Perhaps they felt sorry for him, this broken man who posed no real threat to anyone. Or perhaps they were simply following instructions to treat him with a basic level of dignity. Either way, their kindness made the journey bearable, even as it failed to ease the certainty of what awaited him at its end. As they travelled, Mephibosheth's mind wandered over the landscape of his life, the memories that had sustained him through years of exile, the moments of joy that had punctuated long seasons of quiet desperation. He thought about his father Jonathan, wondered what David remembered about their friendship, whether any trace of affection for Jonathan might extend to mercy for Jonathan's son. But those hopes felt fragile, almost foolish. Kings didn't typically let sentiment interfere with political necessity, and David had proven himself to be a very practical ruler. The same decisiveness that had made him successful as a king might very well seal Mephibosheth's fate. The road to Jerusalem was familiar to merchants and travellers, but it had been decades since Mephibosheth had seen this part of the kingdom. Everything seemed different, larger somehow, more prosperous than he remembered from his childhood. David's reign had brought stability and growth, and the evidence was visible in the well-maintained roads, the thriving settlements, the general air of confidence that marked a kingdom at peace with itself. As they approached the city, Mephibosheth could see the walls and towers that marked David's capital, the seat of power that had replaced his grandfather's dynasty. Somewhere beyond those walls was the palace where David held court, the throne room where his fate would be decided, the king who had once been his father's closest friend. The guards at the city gates recognized the messengers, waved them through without question, and suddenly Mephibosheth found himself inside Jerusalem, breathing the air of the city that had become the center of Israel's political life. People moved through the streets with purpose and energy. Merchants called out their wares. Children played in courtyards. Life continued its normal rhythms, while his own life approached what seemed certain to be its conclusion. The palace itself was impressive, not as grand as his grandfather's had been, but solid, purposeful, designed more for function than for intimidation. The guards were professional, courteous, efficient. This was clearly a well-run kingdom, organized and confident under David's leadership. Mephibosheth was given time to clean himself, to rest from the journey, to prepare for his audience with the king. The servants who attended him were kind, bringing water for washing, food for strength. clean clothes to replace his travel-stained garments. Their courtesy felt almost cruel, this gentle treatment of a man who was probably being prepared for execution. As the moment of the audience approached, Mephibosheth found himself thinking not about his own fate, but about his family back in Lo-Debar. His wife would be watching the road, waiting for news that would probably never come. His son would be asking questions, wondering when his father would return, not understanding that some journeys don't have happy endings. The final preparations were completed in silence. Mephibosheth, dressed in the clean robes that had been provided, tried to arrange his appearance in a way that would honour the gravity of appearing before the king, even if that appearance was to be his last act as a living man. When the time came, when the summons arrived to appear before David, Mephibosheth felt a strange kind of peace settle over him. The waiting was over. The uncertainty was about to end, and whatever happened next would at least be definitive. He had lived for years with the possibility of this moment, and now it was finally here. The guards who escorted him to the throne room were respectful, their manner suggesting that they were following careful instructions about how he was to be treated. But respect and kindness don't change the fundamental reality of power, and Mephibosheth understood that he was walking toward a confrontation with forces completely beyond his control. His legs, damaged and weak as they were, carried him slowly but steadily toward whatever awaited him in David's presence. Each step was difficult, but each step also brought him closer to the end of uncertainty, to answers that had been decades in the making, to a conversation that would determine whether his story ended here or continued in ways he couldn't imagine. As they approached the doors of the throne room, Mephibosheth whispered a prayer, not for rescue, because rescue seemed impossible, but for courage, for dignity, for the strength to face whatever was coming with something resembling grace. The doors opened, and beyond them waited David, the shepherd boy who had become king, the man who had loved Jonathan like a brother, the ruler who now held Mephibosheth's life in his hands. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it the end of exile and the beginning of something that neither Mephibosheth nor anyone else could have predicted. But that is a story for the next part of our journey together. For now, we leave him at the threshold, a broken man about to discover whether the king who remembered his father's friendship would extend that memory to mercy, or whether the politics of power would demand a different kind of resolution entirely. The throne room doors opened with the kind of slow deliberation that makes every second feel like an eternity, and Mephibosheth found himself looking into a chamber that somehow managed to be both impressive and welcoming, grand enough to remind visitors they were in the presence of royalty, but not so overwhelming as to make them feel crushed by the weight of power. David sat on his throne with the relaxed authority of a man comfortable with leadership, but as Mephibosheth's eyes met the king's, he saw something he hadn't expected. This wasn't the cold stare of a ruler calculating political advantage. This was the gaze of someone trying to see past the years, trying to recognize something familiar in the face before him. Mephibosheth. David's voice carried a note of gentle inquiry, almost as if he were afraid he might be mistaken, as if the man standing before him might be someone else entirely. The sound of his own name spoken by the king sent a shock through Mephibosheth's system. For years, He had been simply the crippled man who lives with Mashir, or that son of Jonathan, spoken in whispers and careful tones. But here, in this place of power, his name was being spoken aloud, clearly, without shame or fear. Mephibosheth's response was immediate and instinctive, the only response a man of his background and circumstances could make when summoned before the throne. Despite the pain it caused his damaged legs, despite the difficulty of the movement, he fell face down before David, pressing his forehead to the cold stone floor in the ultimate gesture of submission and respect. "At your service," he managed to say, his voice probably muffled by his position, but the words clear enough to convey his complete surrender to whatever fate the king had decided for him. It was the response of a man who understood his powerlessness, who recognized that his life hung in the balance of another man's decision. But even as he lay prostrate before the throne, Mephibosheth was acutely aware of the physical struggle this position represented. His legs, twisted and weak, couldn't support him properly, and maintaining this posture of respect was actually causing him considerable pain. Still, protocol demanded it, survival required it, and dignity insisted that he show proper honour to the king, even if that king was about to order his death. Think about the complexity of this moment. Here was David, the shepherd boy who had become king, looking down at the son of his dearest friend, the child of the man who had saved his life countless times, who had given up his own claim to the throne out of love, who had died defending Israel against its enemies. And here was Mephibosheth, the grandson of Saul, the man who had hunted David through the wilderness, who had tried repeatedly to kill him, who had driven David into exile and made him a fugitive in his own land. The irony was almost overwhelming. The son of David's greatest friend was also the grandson of David's greatest enemy. From his position on the floor, Mephibosheth could see only stone and shadows, could hear only the sound of his own rapid breathing and the whispered conversations of courtiers who were probably as curious as anyone about why this broken man had been summoned to the king's presence. The silence stretched on, and in that silence, Mephibosheth's mind raced through possibilities, through scenarios, through the various ways this encounter might unfold. Would David speak words of condemnation? Would guards step forward to drag him away? Would this stone floor be the last thing he ever saw? But the silence wasn't hostile. It felt more like contemplation, as if David were taking time to really see the man before him, to process the reality of Jonathan's son, to decide not just what justice demanded, but what mercy might allow. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only moments, David spoke again, and his voice carried a tone that Mephibosheth couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger. It wasn't coldness. It was something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like kindness. But we'll have to wait to hear those words, because in this moment, Mephibosheth is still pressed against the floor, still waiting, still believing that his next breath might be his last. He has travelled from exile to the throne room, from forgotten poverty to the centre of royal power. And now he waits to discover whether that journey ends in death or something else entirely. The weight of his body against the stone, the ache in his twisted legs, the rapid beating of his heart, all of it combined to create a moment of such intensity that it seemed to exist outside of normal time. This was the hinge point of his life, the instant when everything would change, though he had no idea yet in which direction that change would lead. David was seeing more than just a crippled man on his throne room floor. He was seeing Jonathan's eyes, Jonathan's features, the unmistakable family resemblance that connected this broken figure to the friend he had loved more than his own life. He was remembering promises made in youth, covenants sworn in the wilderness, words spoken by a prince who had valued friendship more than power. The courtiers in the room were probably holding their breath, wondering what this unusual scene meant, why their king had summoned this obviously poor and disabled man. What purpose could be served by bringing Saul's grandson into David's presence? But none of them could understand what David was feeling, the mixture of grief and joy, sorrow for Jonathan's death and wonder at finding his son alive, the weight of promises long remembered, and the joy of finally being able to honour them. Mephibosheth, meanwhile, remained face down, waiting for words that would determine his future, unaware that the king looking down at him was seeing not an enemy to be eliminated, but a debt to be paid, not a threat to be removed, but a promise to be fulfilled. The moment stretched on, pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of history and the lightness of grace, balanced on the knife's edge between fear and hope, between the past's debts and the future's promises. And in that stretched moment, before the words were spoken that would change everything, both men were suspended in the space between what had been and what was about to become, between the story they thought they knew and the story that was actually being written, between the justice they expected and the mercy they couldn't yet imagine. The throne room, with its stone walls and royal tapestries, became a sacred space, a place where the ordinary rules of power and politics were about to be transformed by something much more powerful, something that sounded like a king's voice but carried the authority of divine love, something that would lift a broken man from the floor and seat him at a table where he had never dared to dream he might belong. But those words haven't been spoken yet. That transformation hasn't yet occurred. For now, there is only the waiting, the silence, the moment before everything changes, the breath before the word that will turn exile into homecoming, fear into wonder, and a throne room floor into holy ground. Mephibosheth, pressed against the stone, doesn't know it yet, but he is about to hear words that will sound too good to be true, words that will redefine everything he thought he knew about himself, about David, about what it means to receive grace when you deserve judgment, kindness when you expect execution. The next words spoken in this throne room will echo through history, will become part of the greatest story ever told about what it means to show undeserved kindness, to remember promises when no one would hold you accountable for forgetting them, to demonstrate that mercy is more powerful than justice, and that love is stronger than fear. But for now, in this moment, there is only the waiting, and the certainty that whatever comes next will be definitive, final, life-changing in ways that can't be undone or taken back. The king is about to speak, and when he does, everything will change. Don't be afraid. Those 3 words fell into the silence of the throne room like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through everything Mephibosheth thought he knew about his situation, his future, his very survival. "Don't be afraid." They were the last words he had expected to hear. The most impossible greeting he could have imagined. Kings don't typically begin conversations with condemned men by telling them not to fear. Rulers don't usually offer comfort to the relatives of their enemies. Power doesn't normally speak with such gentleness to weakness. But there was something in David's voice, a warmth that cut through the formality of the throne room, through the protocol of royal audiences, through the barrier of years and circumstances that separated a king from a broken exile. This wasn't the voice of political calculation. This was the voice of someone who had been waiting for this moment, who had been hoping for this opportunity, who had something important to say. "Don't be afraid," David continued, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan." Your father Jonathan. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with memory and meaning, rich with stories of friendship and loyalty that had transcended politics and position. David wasn't seeing just another descendant of Saul's dynasty. He was seeing the son of the man who had been closer to him than a brother, whose friendship had sustained him through the darkest years of his life. Mephibosheth, still face down on the throne room floor, felt his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. Kindness, for Jonathan's sake? This was the opposite of everything he had expected, the reverse of every scenario he had imagined during those long years of exile, during the terrifying journey to Jerusalem, during the sleepless night before this audience. He had come prepared for condemnation and was hearing words of grace. He had expected judgment and was receiving promises of mercy. He had anticipated death and was being offered what exactly? What did kindness for Jonathan's sake mean in practical terms? David wasn't finished speaking, and his next words began to paint a picture of grace so extravagant that Mephibosheth might have thought he was dreaming, if not for the cold reality of the stone floor against his face, the ache in his legs, the pounding of his heart that confirmed this was all actually happening. "I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, all the land, not just a small portion, not just a token gesture, but everything. The fields and vineyards, the olive groves and pastures, the houses and barns, the wealth that had been accumulated over generations of Saul's reign. All of it was being restored in a single declaration." Think about what this meant. Mephibosheth had lived in poverty for decades, dependent on the charity of others, scraping by on whatever work his limitations allowed, worrying constantly about providing for his family. And now, with a few words from the king, he was being made wealthy again, restored to the economic position his family had lost when Saul's dynasty fell. But David wasn't done. There was more. Something even more extraordinary than the restoration of property. Something that would elevate Mephibosheth beyond mere financial security to a position he could never have imagined. "And you will always eat at my table." The king's table, not just an invitation to an occasional meal, not just a ceremonial honour to be granted once and remembered forever, but a permanent place at the royal table, a daily reminder that he belonged in the king's presence, that he was welcome in the royal household, that he had been adopted into the family of the man who had loved his father. In ancient cultures, sharing a meal was one of the most intimate acts of fellowship. To eat at someone's table was to be accepted as family, to be granted protection, to be included in the inner circle of trust and affection, and the king's table was the highest honour possible, reserved for sons and daughters, for the most trusted advisers, for those who belonged to the royal household. Mephibosheth was being offered more than restoration. He was being offered adoption, more than property. He was being given position, more than wealth. He was being granted worth in the eyes of the king, value that had nothing to do with his usefulness or his ability to contribute, everything to do with whose son he was. "Don't be afraid," David had said, and now Mephibosheth was beginning to understand why that assurance had been necessary. This wasn't just unexpected, it was overwhelming. Grace on a scale that defied comprehension. Kindness so extravagant that it seemed almost dangerous to believe. But the voice speaking these promises was the voice of the king. These weren't idle words or empty gestures. They carried the full weight of royal authority, the complete power of the throne, the absolute guarantee that what David promised would be fulfilled. Mephibosheth was still pressed against the floor, but now the cold stone beneath his face felt different, not like the place where his life would end, but like the place where it would begin again. Not like the site of his execution, but like the altar where his transformation would be offered and accepted. He was beginning to understand that the summons to Jerusalem hadn't been about eliminating threats to David's kingdom. It had been about honouring debts to David's heart, not about politics, but about promises, not about justice, but about joy, the joy of finally being able to repay, in some small measure, the enormous debt he owed to Jonathan's memory. David was looking down at the prostrate figure before his throne and seeing not what Mephibosheth was, but what he could become, not the crippled exile who had lived in poverty and fear, but the honoured guest who would sit at the royal table, the wealthy landowner who would want for nothing, the living reminder of the greatest friendship in David's life. The silence in the throne room was no longer heavy with dread. It was pregnant with possibility, rich with the promise of transformation, alive with the reality that sometimes, just sometimes, the story turns out better than anyone dared to hope. Mephibosheth was about to lift his face from the floor to look into the eyes of the king who had just redefined his entire existence, to speak words of response to grace so overwhelming that no response could possibly be adequate. But even before he moved, even before he spoke, the transformation was already complete. The words had been spoken, the promises had been made, the grace had been declared, and nothing would ever be the same. "Don't be afraid," David had said, and in that simple command, Mephibosheth was discovering that fear and wonder cannot coexist, that terror and joy are mutually exclusive, that the presence of overwhelming grace has a way of casting out every shadow of doubt and apprehension. He was still the same man who had fallen from his nurse's arms decades ago, still disabled, still bearing the physical limitations that had shaped his entire life. But everything else, everything that mattered, had been transformed by 3 simple words spoken by a king who remembered his promises, who honoured his debts, who showed kindness not because it was deserved, but because it was who he was. The man who had entered the throne room as a condemned prisoner was about to rise as an adopted son. The exile was about to become family. The forgotten was about to be remembered, honoured, and loved. Don't be afraid. Those words were still echoing in the chamber, still working their way into Mephibosheth's heart, still transforming everything he thought he knew about himself, about David, about what it means to receive grace when you're expecting judgment, kindness when you're anticipating cruelty, love when you're prepared for loss. The king had spoken, and his words had power, the power to change not just circumstances, but identities, not just situations, but souls, not just the external facts of a life, but the internal reality of worth and belonging and hope. Mephibosheth was about to discover what it feels like to be lifted from the floor by grace, to be seated at a table you never earned the right to approach, to be welcomed into a family you never dared to imagine joining. But that moment of rising, of responding, of beginning to live in the reality of this extravagant kindness, that moment is still coming, still approaching, still building in the sacred space between the king's promise and the recipient's response, between the offer of grace and its acceptance, between the word spoken and the word received. For now, there are only the echoes of "Don't be afraid," still working their way into every corner of fear, every shadow of doubt, every assumption about how the world works and what broken people can expect from those who hold power over their lives. The revolution was beginning, not with armies or violence, but with words, with promises, with the kind of radical kindness that changes everything it touches, that redefines what's possible, that demonstrates the truth that grace is always more powerful than judgment, always more beautiful than justice, always more transformative than punishment. Don't be afraid. 3 words that changed everything. 3 words that are still changing everything. 3 words that remind us that sometimes, when we expect the worst, we receive the best. When we brace for condemnation, we discover grace. When we prepare for endings, we encounter beginnings. As the reality of David's words began to sink in, as the impossible promises started to feel like something that might actually be true, David continued speaking, and his voice took on the tone of someone sharing a sacred memory, recounting something too precious to be forgotten, too important to be left unexplained. "Your father Jonathan," David said. And even after all these years, even with the weight of kingship on his shoulders, there was still wonder in his voice when he spoke that name. Still the echo of a friendship that had shaped him in ways that time could not diminish. "Your father and I made a covenant," David continued, "a promise that bound our lives together, our futures together, our families together, not just for a season, but forever." Picture David as he spoke these words. No longer just the king addressing a subject, but a man remembering his dearest friend, sharing stories that had been locked in his heart for decades, finally able to honour debts that had been accumulating interest in the treasury of his memory. "I remember the day we swore that oath." David's voice grew distant, transported back to a time when both men were young, when the future was uncertain, when friendship was the only certainty in a world of political chaos and personal danger. We were hiding from your grandfather, your father and I, meeting in secret because Saul had already decided I was a threat, already determined to eliminate me before I could challenge his power. But Jonathan, your father, he chose loyalty to our friendship over loyalty to his father's fears. Think about what David was describing. The prince who should have seen David as a rival, who should have supported his father's efforts to maintain the dynasty, instead chose to protect the very person who represented the greatest threat to his own inheritance. Jonathan had given up his claim to the throne, not through defeat or coercion, but through love. We met in the wilderness, David continued, in a place where we could speak freely, where we could make promises without fear of being overheard, where we could bind our lives together with words that would outlast kingdoms. Mephibosheth, still prostrate before the throne, was hearing the story of his father's greatest decision, the choice that had defined Jonathan's character and sealed his legacy. This wasn't just ancient history. This was the foundation of everything that was happening in this throne room. The reason why grace was being offered instead of judgment, why restoration was being promised instead of execution. Your father said to me, David's voice became even more tender, as if he were quoting words that had been engraved on his heart. The Lord shall be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants, forever. Forever. That word hung in the air of the throne room like a promise too large to be contained by any single moment, too vast to be limited by the circumstances of any particular generation. Jonathan hadn't just made a promise for himself. He had bound his family, his children, his children's children, to a covenant relationship with David that would transcend death itself. He stripped off his robe, David continued, his royal robe, the symbol of his position as heir to the throne, and he gave it to me, not as a loan, not as a temporary gesture, but as a gift, a sign that he was transferring his claim, his inheritance, his future, to me. The significance of this action was staggering. In ancient cultures, a prince's robe was more than clothing. It was a symbol of authority, of destiny, of divine calling. By giving it to David, Jonathan was saying that he recognized God's choice, that he was willingly stepping aside, that he was blessing the very transition that would cost his family their dynasty and his armor. David's voice was filled with awe, even after all these years. He gave me his armor, his sword, his bow, his belt, everything that marked him as a warrior, as a prince, as someone destined for greatness. He gave it all to me, and he did it joyfully, because he loved me more than he loved his own future. Mephibosheth was beginning to understand the magnitude of what his father had done, the sacrifice that had been made, the love that had been demonstrated. Jonathan had chosen friendship over ambition, covenant over convenience, love over legacy. And that choice, made decades ago in the wilderness, was now bearing fruit in this throne room. But the covenant wasn't just about giving up, David explained. It was also about taking on. When your father bound his life to mine, he was also binding mine to his. I promised him. I swore to him. that I would care for his family, that I would show kindness to his descendants, that I would honour his memory by protecting those he loved. This was the heart of it, the reason why Mephibosheth was hearing words of grace instead of condemnation. David wasn't just being generous. He wasn't just showing arbitrary mercy. He was fulfilling a sacred obligation, honouring a debt that he had willingly taken on, keeping a promise that no one else would have held him accountable for remembering. "I have been looking for you," David said, and now his voice carried a note of urgency, of long-suppressed eagerness. "I have been asking, searching, hoping to find someone from Jonathan's family to whom I could show the kindness I promised him." Think about the beautiful irony of this revelation. While Mephibosheth had been living in fear that David might discover his existence, David had been actively searching for any surviving member of Jonathan's line, not to eliminate them, but to bless them, not to punish them, but to honour them, not to settle old scores, but to pay old debts. "You have been hiding from me," David continued with what might have been a gentle smile in his voice. "While I have been looking for you, you have been afraid of my justice while I have been eager to show you my kindness. You have been expecting death while I have been planning life." The role reversal was complete. Everything Mephibosheth had assumed about his situation had been exactly wrong. The king he feared was the king who had been seeking him. The judgment he expected was the kindness he was receiving. The death he anticipated was the life he was being offered. "This is what covenant means," David explained. "It means that the promises we make to those we love don't die when they die. It means that loyalty survives loss, that friendship transcends death, that the debts we owe to the dead are paid to the living." David was teaching Mephibosheth, and everyone else in that throne room, about the nature of covenant love, about what it means to make promises that last beyond the people who make them, about the kind of faithfulness that honours relationships even when those relationships seem to have ended. "Your father loved me when I was nobody." David's voice grew thick with emotion. "He protected me when I was hunted. He encouraged me when I was discouraged. He chose me when choosing me cost him everything. Now I choose you. I protect you. I bless you, not because of who you are, but because of who your father was." This was grace in its purest form. Unmerited favour flowing from one person to another, not because of the recipient's worth, but because of the giver's love for someone else. Mephibosheth was being blessed, not because he had earned it, but because Jonathan had been loved, not because he deserved it, but because David kept his promises. "The covenant I made with your father extends to you," David declared. "You are not just receiving my kindness, you are receiving your father's inheritance, the blessing he secured for his family when he chose love over power, when he chose friendship over position, when he chose covenant over convenience. The restoration of Saul's lands, the invitation to the royal table, the permanent place in David's household. All of it was flowing from decisions made decades earlier, from promises sworn in secret, from a friendship that had been stronger than death, from love that had been patient enough to wait for the right moment to express itself. Mephibosheth was discovering that he was not an accident. not a forgotten afterthought, not a remnant that had somehow survived the collapse of his grandfather's dynasty. He was a promise kept, a covenant honoured, a love letter written by his father and delivered by David, a living testament to the power of friendship to transcend time and circumstance. This is why you must not be afraid, David concluded, because you are not here as Saul's grandson. You are here as Jonathan's son. You are not here because of what your grandfather did to me. You are here because of what your father did for me. You are not here as my enemy. You are here as my beloved friend's beloved child. The transformation was complete. The identity shift was total. Mephibosheth was no longer the dangerous descendant of a fallen dynasty. He was the treasured son of David's dearest friend, no longer a liability to be managed, but a legacy to be honoured, no longer a threat to be eliminated, but a promise to be fulfilled. The covenant remembered had become the covenant applied. The love between two young men had become the grace extended to the next generation. The friendship that had seemed to end with Jonathan's death had been revealed as something that would never end, something that would continue to bear fruit in ways that neither friend could have imagined when they first bound their lives together. David had kept his word, honoured his debt, remembered his promise. And in doing so, he had demonstrated that some things are stronger than death, that some love is more powerful than loss, that some promises are worth keeping even when no one is watching, even when no one would blame you for forgetting, even when the cost of remembering is greater than the penalty for forgetting. The covenant had been remembered, and in that remembering, everything had changed. After hearing David's explanation of the covenant, after understanding the depth of love that had connected his father to the king, after grasping the magnitude of grace being offered to him, Mephibosheth finally found his voice, though what came out was barely more than a whisper, thick with emotion and heavy with disbelief. "What is your servant?" he began, his words halting, searching, struggling to find language adequate for this moment. "That you should notice a dead dog like me." A dead dog. Those were the words Mephibosheth chose to describe himself. Not just a dog, which would have been self-deprecating enough, but a dead dog. Something not just lowly, but completely worthless. Something that deserved nothing but to be ignored, discarded, forgotten. Think about the weight of that self-description. This was how Mephibosheth saw himself after years of exile, years of poverty, years of living with the constant awareness that his very existence was a potential threat to the king's security. He wasn't just humble, he was crushed, not just modest, but convinced of his own worthlessness. In the ancient world, dogs weren't the beloved pets we know today. They were scavengers, creatures that lived on the margins of human society, tolerated but not treasured, useful but not valued. And a dead dog, that was the ultimate symbol of worthlessness, something that had outlived even its marginal usefulness, something that contributed nothing and deserved nothing. But David, hearing these words from the man he was determined to honour, must have felt a mixture of grief and determination. Grief that Jonathan's son had been so broken by circumstances that he could only see himself as refuse, and determination to demonstrate just how wrong that assessment was. "You ask what you are," David might have thought to himself. You are the son of the man who saved my life more times than I can count. You are the living reminder of the greatest friendship I have ever known. You are the opportunity I have been waiting for, the chance to honour a debt I feared I would never be able to repay. But Mephibosheth couldn't see any of that. All he could see was his own brokenness, his own limitations, his own failure to live up to the destiny that should have been his birthright. He was looking at himself through the lens of his circumstances rather than through the lens of his inheritance, through the filter of his disabilities rather than through the perspective of his father's love. A dead dog, he had said, and in those words, we hear the voice of everyone who has ever felt worthless, everyone who has ever believed they had nothing to offer, everyone who has ever wondered why anyone would waste time on them, why anyone would show them kindness, why anyone would see value where they see only failure. It's the voice of the person who has been told too many times that they don't matter. The voice of someone who has internalized the world's assessment of their worth. The voice of anyone who has looked in the mirror and seen only what they lack rather than what they carry. But David's response to this self-deprecation was swift and decisive. He didn't argue with Mephibosheth's assessment, didn't try to convince him that he was wrong about his own worth, didn't waste time debating the fine points of self-esteem and personal value. Instead, David simply proceeded with his plans, calling for his servants, giving instructions, putting into motion the machinery of grace that would transform Mephibosheth's life regardless of how Mephibosheth saw himself. "Ziba," David called, summoning the man who had first told him about Mephibosheth's existence, the former servant of Saul's household who had been living quietly through the transition from one dynasty to another. When Ziba appeared, probably wondering why he was being summoned again, David gave him instructions that must have shocked everyone present. "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for." Think about what David was doing. He was taking Ziba, a man who had been free to pursue his own interests, and placing him in service to Mephibosheth, requiring him to manage the restored properties, to oversee the farming, to ensure that Mephibosheth would have not just wealth, but ongoing income, not just a gift, but a livelihood. "But Mephibosheth," David continued, making sure everyone understood the most important part of this arrangement. "Your master's grandson will always eat at my table. Always. Not occasionally, not when convenient, not as a special honour granted once and remembered forever, but always, every day, every meal, every gathering of the royal family. Mephibosheth would have a place, a chair, a position that could never be taken away, never be revoked, never be questioned." Ziba's response was immediate. "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." He understood that this wasn't a request, it was a royal decree, and his role would be to ensure that David's vision for Mephibosheth's restoration was fully realized. But while the practical arrangements were being made, while the details of property management and agricultural oversight were being discussed, Mephibosheth was still trying to process the reality of what was happening to him. From dead dog to honoured guest at the king's table, from worthless exile to wealthy landowner, from forgotten remnant to permanent member of the royal household. The transformation was so complete, so overwhelming, so far beyond anything he could have imagined that he could barely take it in. He was learning something that many people never discover, that our assessment of our own worth is often the least reliable measure of our actual value, that the way we see ourselves is frequently distorted by pain, by failure, by the accumulated weight of disappointment and loss. Mephibosheth saw himself as a dead dog, but David saw him as a treasured son. Mephibosheth focused on his disabilities, but David focused on his heritage. Mephibosheth emphasized his limitations, but David emphasized his father's legacy. The gap between self-perception and reality was enormous, and it would take time, probably years, for Mephibosheth to fully internalize the truth of his new position, to really believe that he belonged at the king's table, to accept that he was worthy of such extravagant kindness. But whether he believed it or not, whether he felt worthy or not, whether he could understand it or not, the transformation was real. The decree had been issued, the arrangements had been made, the grace had been granted, and nothing could undo what David had decided to do. This is often how grace works. It comes to us when we least expect it, when we feel least worthy of it, when we're most convinced that we have nothing to offer and no reason to hope. It doesn't wait for us to clean up our act or improve our circumstances or develop a better opinion of ourselves. Grace finds us in our brokenness, meets us in our poverty, encounters us in our self-loathing, and declares that none of those things matter as much as we thought they did, that there are other factors at work, other considerations in play, other sources of value that we hadn't taken into account. Mephibosheth had called himself a dead dog, but grace had a different name for him. Son, heir, guest, family, beloved. These were the names that mattered, the identity markers that would define his future, the truth about who he was that transcended every limitation, every failure, every reason he had for feeling worthless. The man who thought he deserved nothing was about to discover what it feels like to receive everything. The exile who expected execution was about to experience restoration. The dead dog was about to learn that in the economy of grace, worth isn't determined by what you bring to the table, but by whose son you are, whose love covers you, whose promises include you. David's kindness wasn't conditional on Mephibosheth's self-improvement. It wasn't dependent on his ability to see himself more positively. It wasn't waiting for him to overcome his sense of unworthiness. It simply was. Complete. Total. Irrevocable. A gift that transformed the recipient, whether the recipient felt ready for transformation or not. And perhaps that's the most beautiful thing about this story, that grace doesn't require us to feel worthy before it makes us worthy, doesn't demand that we understand our value before it declares our value, doesn't wait for us to stop seeing ourselves as dead dogs before it seats us at the king's table. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen not because we finally figure out how valuable we are, but because someone else decides to treat us as valuable despite our inability to see it ourselves. Because love is stronger than self-loathing. Because grace is more powerful than shame. Because the king's opinion matters more than our own. Mephibosheth was about to begin the long journey from seeing himself as worthless to understanding himself as treasured. From identifying as a dead dog to embracing his identity as a beloved son. From living in the shadows of exile to walking in the light of royal favour. It would be a process, a gradual awakening to the reality of his new position, a slow recognition that the man who had shown him such kindness wasn't going to change his mind, wasn't going to revoke the offer, wasn't going to discover some reason to regret his generosity. But that journey was about to begin, and it would start, as all the best journeys do, with a single step. The step from the throne room floor to the chair that had been prepared for him at the king's table, from the place of prostration to the place of honour, from the identity of a dead dog to the reality of a living son. In the days that followed that life-changing audience with King David, the practical machinery of grace began to turn, and Mephibosheth discovered that royal promises aren't just beautiful words spoken in throne rooms. They're commitments that reshape entire lives through careful attention to detail, through systematic implementation, through the kind of thorough follow-through that transforms dreams into daily reality. Ziba, the former servant of Saul's household, found himself summoned once again to the palace. This time not to provide information but to receive instructions that would fundamentally change his own life as well as Mephibosheth's. The conversation he had with David's administrators was both a blessing and a burden, an opportunity and an obligation that would define his future in ways he probably hadn't anticipated. "You are to serve Mephibosheth now," the king's officials explained to him. "All the lands that belong to King Saul, all the properties, all the agricultural holdings, all the resources that once supported the royal household, they are being restored to Jonathan's son, and you are being appointed as overseer." Think about the magnitude of what was being described. This wasn't a small inheritance or a token gesture of royal favour. Saul had been king of Israel, and kings in those days accumulated substantial wealth, vast holdings of land, extensive agricultural operations that required dozens, if not hundreds of workers to maintain properly, vineyards that had been producing wine for decades, olive groves that yielded oil for cooking and lighting, fields of grain that could feed entire communities, pastures that supported flocks of sheep and goats, orchards heavy with fruit. All of it was being transferred back to Saul's family line. All of it was becoming Mephibosheth's responsibility. All of it was being placed under Ziba's management. The appointment came with specific instructions that revealed the heart behind David's generosity. "You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, will always eat at the king's table." This arrangement was both practical and profound. Practical because it ensured that Mephibosheth would have ongoing income, not just a one-time gift, but a sustainable source of wealth that would support him and his family for generations to come. Profound because it demonstrated that David's kindness wasn't just about dramatic gestures. It was about long-term care, about creating security that would last. Ziba understood the implications immediately. "I have 15 sons and 20 servants," he reported to the officials, indicating the size of the workforce that would now be dedicated to managing Mephibosheth's restored inheritance. This wasn't a small operation. It was a substantial enterprise that would require significant organisation, careful planning, and dedicated management to operate successfully. The restoration process began immediately. Surveyors went out to identify the exact boundaries of Saul's former holdings, to determine which properties had been taken over by others during the years since the dynasty's fall, to establish clear legal title to everything that was being returned. Royal scribes prepared documents, drew up deeds, created the official records that would make Mephibosheth's ownership legally unquestionable. Meanwhile, workers began the process of assessing the condition of the properties, determining what repairs were needed, what improvements could be made, what resources would be required to bring everything back to full productivity. Some buildings had fallen into disrepair during years of uncertain ownership. Some fields had been neglected. Some equipment needed replacement. But David's commitment to Mephibosheth's restoration wasn't limited by the current condition of the properties. Royal funds were made available for repairs, for improvements, for whatever was needed to ensure that the inheritance would be not just returned, but restored to its full potential value. Think about what this meant for Mephibosheth personally, the man who had struggled to contribute meaningfully to Mashiach's household, who had worried about being a burden, who had lived with the constant anxiety of economic insecurity, was now the owner of vast estates, the employer of dozens of workers, the master of properties that generated substantial income. His wife, who had married him knowing that their future would be marked by poverty and uncertainty, was now the wife of a wealthy landowner, the mistress of estates that had once belonged to kings, the mother of children who would inherit not just royal blood but royal resources. His son, who had been playing in the dust of Lodabar, unaware of his grandfather's legacy, was now the heir to substantial wealth, the future owner of properties that would provide security for generations, the bearer of a name that carried both history and hope. But the most remarkable aspect of this restoration was how it revealed David's character. He could have simply invited Mephibosheth to live at the palace, could have provided him with a room and meals and called it generous. Instead, he restored full dignity, complete independence, total security, ensuring that Mephibosheth would never again have to depend on anyone's charity. The lands being restored weren't just property, they were identity. They represented Mephibosheth's rightful place in society, his legitimate claim to respect and recognition, his connection to a heritage that had been interrupted but not destroyed, his restoration to a position that was his by right of birth, not by gift of the king. Ziba's role in this arrangement was crucial. As overseer of the properties, he would ensure that Mephibosheth received the full benefit of his inheritance without having to personally manage every detail. The physical limitations that had shaped Mephibosheth's life for decades wouldn't prevent him from enjoying the fruits of his restored estate. The servants who had once worked for Saul, who had scattered when the dynasty fell, who had found new employment wherever they could, were now being gathered back, restored to their original purpose, reunited with the family they had once served. It was a restoration that extended beyond one man to encompass an entire household, an entire community, an entire way of life. And yet, for all the magnificence of the material restoration, David made sure that everyone understood what mattered most. Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, will always eat at the king's table. The wealth was wonderful, the security was important, the dignity was essential, but the relationship was everything. The invitation to the royal table wasn't just about food, It was about family. It wasn't just about meals. It was about belonging. It wasn't just about eating. It was about being loved, accepted, valued, treasured, honoured not for what he brought to the table, but for whose son he was. This was restoration beyond dreams, grace beyond imagination, kindness beyond comprehension. It was the kind of transformation that reminds us that sometimes, when we think our story is ending, it's actually just beginning. That when we assume we've lost everything, we might be about to gain more than we ever dared to hope. The machinery of grace had been set in motion, and it was thorough, complete, overwhelming in its generosity, beautiful in its attention to detail, perfect in its understanding of what true restoration requires. Not just the return of what was lost, but the creation of something better than what had been before. The first time Mephibosheth approached the royal dining hall, his heart was pounding so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. Here he was, the man who just days earlier had been scraping by in Lodabar, about to sit down at the same table where King David took his meals, where the royal family gathered, where the most important conversations in the kingdom took place. His damaged legs made the walk to the dining hall slow and careful, each step a reminder of his physical limitations, each uneven movement a potential source of embarrassment in this place of royal elegance. The servants who escorted him were kind, patient, ready to offer assistance if needed, but Mephibosheth was acutely aware that he moved differently than everyone else, that his disability would be visible to everyone present. The dining hall itself was magnificent without being overwhelming, designed to reflect the dignity of the king while still feeling welcoming to guests. Long tables made from the finest wood, chairs cushioned with soft fabrics, oil lamps that cast warm light across faces gathered in fellowship. The whole atmosphere spoke of both power and hospitality, of a king who was comfortable enough with his authority to make others comfortable in his presence. David was already seated when Mephibosheth arrived, and the king's face broke into a genuine smile of welcome, the kind of expression that immediately puts nervous guests at ease. "Mephibosheth," David said warmly. "Come, sit here beside me. This is your place. It will always be your place." Your place. Those words carried weight that went far beyond simple seating arrangements. In ancient cultures, where you sat at a meal communicated everything about your status, your relationship to the host, your importance in the social hierarchy. To be seated beside the king wasn't just an honour, it was a declaration of belonging, of family relationship, of permanent acceptance. But as Mephibosheth made his way to the chair that had been prepared for him, he was overwhelmed by self-consciousness, his legs, his slow movements, his obvious physical limitations. All of it felt magnified in this setting of royal refinement. He worried that he would somehow embarrass himself, somehow prove unworthy of the kindness being shown to him. David seemed to sense his guest's nervousness, and with the intuitive kindness that had endeared him to so many people throughout his life, he began to talk, to share stories, to create the kind of conversational atmosphere that helps anxious people relax and feel included. "Tell me about your family," David said as servants began bringing the evening meal. "I want to hear about your wife, your children, your life in Lodabar." I've been searching for you for so long, and now I want to know everything." As they talked, as David asked questions and listened with genuine interest to the answers, Mephibosheth began to understand something profound about this man who had become king. David's greatness wasn't just about military victories or political wisdom. It was about his ability to make people feel seen, heard, valued, important, regardless of their circumstances or limitations. The food, when it came, was beyond anything Mephibosheth had experienced in years. Fresh bread, perfectly prepared meat, vegetables seasoned with herbs and spices, wine that had been carefully selected for its quality, everything presented with care and attention to detail that reflected the respect being shown to every person at the table. But more than the food, more than the elegant surroundings, more than the honour of sitting beside the king, what struck Mephibosheth most powerfully was the atmosphere of family. This wasn't a formal state dinner or a political gathering. This was a family meal where people cared about each other, shared their days, laughed together, created the kind of memories that bind lives together. David's children were present, and they welcomed Mephibosheth with the easy acceptance that comes naturally to young people who take their cues from their father's example. If their father considered this man family, then he was family, and they treated him accordingly, including him in their conversations, asking about his son, making him feel like he belonged. As the meal progressed, Mephibosheth found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't in years, the constant vigilance that had marked his life in exile, the perpetual awareness of being an outsider, the careful monitoring of every word and gesture to avoid giving offence. All of it began to fade as he realized that this acceptance was genuine, that this welcome was real, that this place at the table was truly his. David made sure to include Mephibosheth in every conversation, to ask his opinion on various matters, to treat him as someone whose thoughts and perspectives were valued. It wasn't condescending attention, the kind that highlights differences while pretending to ignore them. It was the natural inclusion of someone who was considered part of the family. When other guests commented on Mephibosheth's presence, David's responses were always warm and proud. "This is Jonathan's son," he would say, "my dear friend's boy, and therefore my own son as well." There was never any hesitation, never any awkwardness, never any suggestion that Mephibosheth's presence required explanation or justification. As the evening wore on, as the conversation flowed and the laughter came more easily, Mephibosheth experienced something he had almost forgotten was possible: simple joy in human fellowship, the pleasure of being known and accepted, the warmth of belonging somewhere, of having people who were genuinely glad to see him, who looked forward to his presence, who missed him when he was absent. His physical limitations, which had seemed so prominent when he first entered the dining hall, became less and less noticeable as the evening progressed, not because they disappeared, but because they mattered less in an environment where people were valued for who they were rather than for what they could do, where worth was determined by relationship rather than by ability, where love covered what law might have condemned. When the meal finally ended, when the last conversations had been shared and the final farewells exchanged, David walked with Mephibosheth toward his chambers, continuing their conversation, extending the fellowship, making sure his guest knew that the evening's end didn't mean the relationship's end. "Tomorrow evening," David said as they parted. "Same time, same place. This is your table now. Your family. Your home. You never have to wonder again whether you belong here, because you do. You always will, and nothing will ever change that." As Mephibosheth settled into the comfortable bed that had been prepared for him in his quarters within the palace, as he reflected on the extraordinary transformation his life had undergone, he found himself almost overwhelmed by gratitude, not just for the material blessings, though those were substantial, not just for the security and comfort, though those were wonderful, but for something far more precious, the gift of belonging, of being wanted, of having a place where he was not just tolerated, but treasured. The man who had thought of himself as a dead dog had spent the evening being treated as a beloved son. The exile who had lived in fear had experienced the warmth of family acceptance. The disabled man who had worried about being a burden had discovered that his limitations didn't disqualify him from love, from honor, from the kind of relationship that transforms identity and redefines possibility. Tomorrow would bring another invitation to the king's table, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each meal would be another opportunity to experience grace, to practice belonging, to grow more comfortable with the reality of his new identity, to internalize the truth that he was loved, not despite his limitations, but as he was, completely, unconditionally, permanently. The table that had seemed so intimidating on this first evening would gradually become familiar, welcoming, home. The king whose presence had initially overwhelmed him would become father, friend, family. The palace that had seemed foreign would become the place where he belonged, where he was expected, where his presence made the gathering more complete rather than more complicated. This was just the beginning, the first of countless meals, the first of thousands of conversations, the first of many years of discovering what it means to live in the security of unconditional love, in the warmth of permanent acceptance, in the joy of grace that never ends, never runs out, never regrets its generosity, never wishes it had chosen someone else, someone better, someone more worthy of such extravagant kindness. Months passed, and with each day that brought another invitation to the king's table, another conversation with David's family, another night's rest in the comfort of the palace, Mephibosheth found himself undergoing a transformation that went far deeper than changed circumstances. His external life had been revolutionized in a matter of days, but his internal life, his sense of self, his understanding of who he was and what he was worth, those changes took time, patience, and the persistent kindness of people who refused to let him see himself as anything less than beloved. The man who had once described himself as a dead dog was slowly learning to see himself through different eyes, to hear his story told with different words, to understand his identity in ways that had nothing to do with his limitations and everything to do with his relationships, his heritage, his place in the larger story that God was writing through the house of David. It began with small things, moments when he caught himself laughing without self-consciousness, contributing to conversations without apologizing for his presence, expressing opinions without prefacing them with disclaimers about his unworthiness. These were tiny victories, but they represented seismic shifts in how he understood his right to exist in spaces of honor, his permission to take up room in places of importance, his freedom to be himself without constantly seeking approval or forgiveness for being who he was. David's children played a particularly important role in this transformation. Young people have a way of accepting what adults might question, of embracing what society might reject, of seeing potential where others see problems. They didn't see Mephibosheth as disabled. They saw him as Uncle Mephibosheth, as the friend who told interesting stories about life in the wilderness, as the man who remembered their father's youth and could share memories that illuminated aspects of David's character they had never seen. His relationship with his own son was also changing. When Mephibosheth returned to Lodabar to collect his family, to bring them to Jerusalem to share in his restored fortune, his boy looked at him with new eyes, saw him not as the broken man who had struggled to provide, but as the honoured guest of the king, the wealthy landowner, the man who belonged at the royal table. "Is it really true?" his son asked as they travelled toward Jerusalem. "That King David wants us to live in his city, that he considers us family, that you eat at his table every day." The wonder in the child's voice, the amazement at this reversal of fortune, helped Mephibosheth see his own transformation from an outside perspective, helped him recognize just how dramatically his life had changed. His wife, who had married him when he had nothing to offer but love and loyalty, who had shared his poverty without complaint, who had worried about their future without letting that worry poison their present, was now adjusting to a different kind of life entirely. She was learning to manage a household with servants, to oversee the preparation of meals she didn't have to cook herself, to wear clothes that had been made by skilled craftsmen rather than patched together from whatever materials were available. But more than the material changes, she was witnessing the emotional and spiritual transformation of the man she loved, seeing him grow into a confidence he had never possessed, watching him discover joy in ways that had been impossible during their years of exile, celebrating his gradual acceptance of his own worth, his slow but steady embrace of his identity as someone cherished rather than merely tolerated. The lands that had been restored to him, the vast properties that now generated income for his family, required regular attention and oversight, even with Ziba managing the day-to-day operations. Mephibosheth found himself travelling to various estates, meeting with workers, making decisions about crops and livestock, engaging with the practical aspects of wealth management in ways that challenged his long-held beliefs about his own capabilities. These responsibilities, which might have seemed overwhelming to someone who had spent years thinking of himself as useless, instead became opportunities for growth, for discovering abilities he hadn't known he possessed, for contributing to the welfare of others in ways that had been impossible when he was focused merely on survival. The workers who now served under his authority, many of whom remembered his grandfather Saul, initially weren't sure what to expect from this man who had returned from exile to reclaim his inheritance. But they quickly discovered that Mephibosheth's years of poverty had taught him empathy. His experience of powerlessness had given him compassion. His knowledge of what it meant to depend on others' kindness had made him a generous and understanding employer. He treated his workers with the same respect he had learned to appreciate from David, paid them fairly, listened to their concerns, created the kind of working environment where people felt valued rather than exploited. His leadership style was shaped not by arrogance or entitlement, but by gratitude, by the recognition that he was stewarding gifts he had never earned, managing resources that had been restored to him by grace rather than by right. At the king's table, his growing confidence became evident to everyone who knew him. He participated more freely in conversations, offered insights drawn from his unique perspective, shared wisdom that came from having experienced both the heights of privilege and the depths of poverty, both the security of belonging and the fear of abandonment, both the comfort of wealth and the anxiety of want. David watched this transformation with the satisfaction of someone who had invested wisely, who had seen potential where others saw problems, who had planted seeds of kindness that were now producing fruit in ways that blessed not just the recipient but everyone around him. The broken man who had prostrated himself on the throne room floor was becoming the confident friend who could challenge the king's ideas, offer different perspectives, contribute to the welfare of the kingdom in ways that went far beyond his formal role. Perhaps most importantly, Mephibosheth was learning to see his disability differently, not as the defining characteristic that made him different from everyone else, but as one aspect of his story, one thread in the tapestry of his identity, one element of his experience that had shaped him but didn't limit him, that had taught him things about resilience and faith and hope that couldn't be learned any other way. His damaged legs, which had once seemed like the primary fact about his existence, became simply part of who he was, like his brown eyes or his particular way of laughing or his love for his family. They affected how he moved through the world, but they didn't determine his worth, didn't limit his capacity for relationship, didn't disqualify him from positions of honor and responsibility. This shift in self-perception, this movement from seeing himself as fundamentally flawed to understanding himself as fundamentally loved, was perhaps the greatest gift David's kindness had given him. It wasn't just that his circumstances had changed, though they had changed dramatically. It was that his identity had been transformed, that he had learned to see himself as God saw him, as David saw him, as his father Jonathan would have seen him, as beloved, valuable, worthy of love and honor and respect. The man who had once been known as the crippled grandson of a fallen king was becoming known as the faithful friend of the current king, the wise counselor, the generous employer, the loving father, the grateful recipient of grace who had learned to extend that same grace to others. His story was being rewritten, not by changing the facts of his past, but by changing the meaning of those facts, by placing them in a larger context of love and redemption, by demonstrating that what we think disqualifies us might actually be what qualifies us for experiences of grace we could never have imagined, for relationships we could never have anticipated, for purposes we could never have conceived. The transformation wasn't complete. Identity shifts take time, and Mephibosheth would continue growing into his new understanding of himself for years to come. But the foundation had been laid, the trajectory had been established, the momentum toward wholeness had been created, and nothing would ever be quite the same. He was learning, slowly but surely, that grace doesn't just change what we have, it changes who we are, and who we are becoming, and who we have always been in the eyes of those who love us most. Years passed in the comfortable rhythm of restored life, and Mephibosheth had grown so accustomed to his place at the king's table, so settled into his identity as David's adopted son, so secure in the routines of palace life, that he had almost forgotten what uncertainty felt like. The fears that had once dominated his existence, the constant awareness of political danger, the perpetual anxiety about survival, all of it had faded into memory, replaced by the deep security that comes from knowing you are loved unconditionally. But then came the day when everything changed again, when the kingdom that had seemed so stable was shaken to its foundations, when the family that had felt so secure was torn apart by betrayal, when loyalty was tested in ways that revealed the true character of everyone involved. David's son, Absalom, the prince who should have been his father's successor and protector, instead became his greatest threat, his most dangerous enemy, his deepest source of heartbreak. The rebellion that Absalom launched against his father wasn't just political, it was personal, fueled by resentment and ambition and a bitter determination to seize power regardless of the cost to family relationships or national stability. The news came to the palace like a thunderclap. Absalom had gathered an army, had declared himself king, had won the support of influential leaders throughout Israel, was marching toward Jerusalem with the clear intention of deposing his father and claiming the throne for himself. David, faced with the choice between fighting his own son in the streets of the capital or fleeing to protect the city from the devastation of civil war, chose exile. The decision to leave Jerusalem was agonizing for David, but it was also strategic. By withdrawing from the city, he could regroup, gather loyal forces, and prepare for the conflict that seemed inevitable while avoiding the kind of urban warfare that would have destroyed the capital and killed countless innocent people. It was the choice of a king who loved his people more than his throne, his city more than his crown. But it was also a choice that put everyone in David's household in an impossible position. Those who had been close to the king, who had benefited from his favour, who had been part of his inner circle, now had to decide whether to follow him into exile and uncertainty, or remain in Jerusalem and hope for mercy from the new regime. For Mephibosheth, the decision should have been simple. David had saved his life, restored his fortune, made him part of the royal family, treated him with kindness that went far beyond any reasonable expectation. Loyalty demanded that he follow David wherever the king chose to go, support him through whatever challenges lay ahead, demonstrate the same faithfulness that David had shown to Jonathan's memory. But Mephibosheth's physical limitations complicated what should have been a straightforward choice. The journey into exile would be difficult, demanding, potentially dangerous for someone who struggled with mobility, who couldn't move quickly when speed might mean the difference between life and death, who might become a burden to companions who needed to travel light and fast. As David prepared to leave Jerusalem, as the loyal members of his household gathered their essential belongings and prepared for the journey into the wilderness, Mephibosheth faced the most difficult decision of his life. His heart wanted to follow David. His gratitude demanded that he remain loyal. His love for the man who had become his second father compelled him to share whatever hardships lay ahead. But his physical reality made that choice complicated. His damaged legs, his need for assistance with mobility, his dependence on accommodations that might not be possible in the harsh conditions of exile. All of it weighed against his desire to demonstrate his loyalty in the most direct and unambiguous way possible. And then Ziba appeared, offering a solution that seemed perfect, too convenient, but appealing in its apparent simplicity. "Let me go with the king," Ziba suggested. "I can provide supplies, support, assistance that will be valuable during the journey, and I can speak for Mephibosheth, represent his interests, ensure that his loyalty is understood even if he cannot physically make the journey himself." It seemed reasonable, practical, even wise. Ziba had been managing Mephibosheth's estates for years, had proven himself capable and reliable, had demonstrated his understanding of what the situation demanded. If anyone could represent Mephibosheth's interests faithfully, surely it would be the man who had been entrusted with so much responsibility, who had been so consistently dependable, who seemed to understand both loyalty and practicality. But Ziba had his own agenda, his own calculations, his own assessment of how this crisis might be turned to his advantage. He had been serving Mephibosheth for years, managing properties that had once been his own responsibility when he served Saul, working for the benefit of someone else when he might have been working for his own enrichment. The rebellion created an opportunity, a chance to change his circumstances, to improve his position, to secure benefits that had been beyond his reach. So when Ziba met David in the wilderness, when he appeared with supplies and provisions for the exiled king, he didn't just offer material support. He offered information, explanation, interpretation of events that painted Mephibosheth in the worst possible light. "Where is your master's grandson?" David asked, probably hoping for news that Mephibosheth was safe, that he was managing as well as possible under the circumstances, that his absence from the exile was temporary, based on practical considerations rather than political calculations. But Ziba's answer was devastating, calculated, designed to poison David's understanding of Mephibosheth's loyalty. "He is staying in Jerusalem because he said, 'Today the house of Israel will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom.'" Think about the cruelty of this lie, the way it twisted Mephibosheth's absence into evidence of betrayal, the way it suggested that the man David had loved and honoured was actually hoping for David's downfall, planning to benefit from the chaos, positioning himself to reclaim the throne that had once belonged to his grandfather. David, exhausted by the stress of exile, heartbroken by his son's betrayal, surrounded by uncertainty about who could be trusted, heard Ziba's words and felt the sharp pain of what seemed like another betrayal, another disappointment, another example of misplaced trust and undeserved kindness repaid with ingratitude. His response was immediate and decisive, shaped by hurt and frustration rather than careful investigation, by the assumption that Ziba, who had been so helpful, so loyal, so willing to sacrifice for David's benefit, must be telling the truth about Mephibosheth, who wasn't present to defend himself, to explain his absence, to clarify his true feelings. "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours," David declared, transferring the entire inheritance, all the restored properties, all the wealth that had been returned to Saul's family, to the man who had just accused Mephibosheth of treachery. Ziba's response was perfectly calculated. "I humbly bow. May I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king." He had achieved his goal, secured his reward, eliminated his oversight, transformed himself from servant to master, through a carefully constructed lie that exploited David's pain and Mephibosheth's absence. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Mephibosheth knew nothing of this conversation, nothing of Ziba's betrayal, nothing of David's decision to strip him of his inheritance. He was simply doing his best to survive the chaos of a city under new management, wondering when he might hear news of David's welfare, hoping for the king's safe return, completely unaware that his loyalty was being questioned, his character assassinated, his life's restoration undone by lies he couldn't answer because he didn't know they had been told. The man who had learned to see himself as beloved, who had grown comfortable with his identity as David's adopted son, who had discovered the joy of secure belonging, was about to face the most severe test of his faith, the most challenging examination of his character, the most painful reminder that in a world of broken relationships and conflicted loyalties, even the most generous grace can be overshadowed by suspicion. Even the deepest love can be clouded by doubt. Even the strongest bonds can be strained by circumstances that test every assumption about trust and faithfulness. But Mephibosheth didn't know any of this yet. For now, he was simply waiting, hoping, trusting that the man who had shown him such extraordinary kindness would continue to believe the best about him, would remember their relationship, would give him the benefit of the doubt, even in the midst of crisis and confusion. The test was coming. The challenge was approaching. The moment when everything would be revealed, when truth would be separated from lies, when real loyalty would be distinguished from calculated opportunism, when the depth of grace would be measured not by its initial generosity, but by its willingness to forgive even the appearance of betrayal, to restore even what seemed irretrievably lost, to demonstrate that love is stronger than doubt, more persistent than suspicion, more powerful than the lies that try to destroy it. The civil war ended as suddenly as it had begun. Absalom's rebellion collapsed when the prince himself was killed in the forest of Ephraim, his grand ambitions coming to nothing, his army scattered, his challenge to his father's authority settled forever in the most tragic way possible. David's victory was complete, but it was also heartbreaking. The triumph of a king overshadowed by the grief of a father who had lost his son. The journey back to Jerusalem was bittersweet. David was returning to his throne, to his palace, to his capital, but the cost of victory had been enormous. The price of restored authority measured in broken relationships and shattered dreams. The kingdom was secure, but the royal family was devastated, and the process of healing would take far longer than the conflict itself had lasted. As David's procession approached the city, as word spread that the king was returning, the people came out to welcome him, to celebrate his victory, to express their loyalty and support. But among the crowds, there was one figure who stood out, someone whose appearance told a story of suffering, of waiting, of faithfulness maintained despite terrible circumstances. When David saw him, the king's heart must have clenched with a mixture of emotions: surprise at Mephibosheth's condition, confusion about what it meant, and perhaps the first stirring of doubt about the accusations Ziba had made during those dark days of exile. This didn't look like a man who had been celebrating his benefactor's downfall. This looked like someone who had been mourning, suffering, waiting in anguish for news of David's welfare. "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" David asked, his voice carefully controlled, his words carrying both the weight of hurt and the possibility of hope, the chance for explanation, for understanding, for the kind of truth that might heal what lies had damaged. Mephibosheth's response came tumbling out, urgent, desperate, heavy with months of suppressed pain and frustrated loyalty. "My lord the king, since I your servant am lame," I said, "I will have my donkey saddled and will ride on it, so I can go with the king. But Ziba my servant deceived me, and he has slandered your servant to my lord the king." The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simple and heartbreaking. Mephibosheth had never intended to abandon David, had never hoped for the king's downfall, had never calculated that Absalom's rebellion might benefit him. He had wanted to follow David into exile, had made plans to join the journey despite his physical limitations, had been preparing to demonstrate his loyalty in the most direct way possible. But Ziba had betrayed that trust, had abandoned his master when departure became inconvenient, had chosen his own advantage over faithful service, and then, in the cruelest twist of all, had used David's exile as an opportunity to destroy the man he was supposed to serve, to poison the relationship he was supposed to protect, to steal the inheritance he was supposed to manage. "He slandered your servant to my lord the king," Mephibosheth continued, his voice breaking with the pain of being misunderstood, of having his loyalty questioned, of losing not just his material inheritance, but something far more precious, David's trust, David's belief in his character, David's confidence in the relationship they had built together over years of shared meals and growing friendship. But then Mephibosheth said something that revealed the depth of his transformation, the completeness of his understanding of grace, the way David's original kindness had changed not just his circumstances, but his very soul. "But my lord the king is like an angel of God," he said, "so do whatever pleases you." Like an angel of God, even in his pain, even after losing everything, even when he had been wrongly accused and unjustly punished, Mephibosheth's first instinct was not to demand justice, but to affirm his trust in David's character, to acknowledge the king's right to make decisions, to submit to whatever judgment seemed appropriate, because his security didn't depend on being understood by others. It depended on knowing who he was in relationship to the king who had first shown him grace. "All my grandfather's descendants deserved nothing but death from my lord the king," he continued, making sure David understood that even if the worst accusations were true, even if he had been disloyal, the king's original kindness had been so extravagant, so undeserved, so far beyond anything that could be claimed as a right, that gratitude was still the only appropriate response. "But you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table." The reference to the table, to that daily experience of belonging, of acceptance, of family relationship, carried all the weight of what had been lost, what had been precious, what had mattered more than wealth or status or material security. "So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king?" It was a question that came from the heart of someone who had learned the true nature of grace, who understood that it can't be earned, can't be demanded, can't be claimed as a debt owed, but only received with gratitude when it's offered, treasured when it's given, mourned when it seems to be withdrawn. David was witnessing something extraordinary, a demonstration of the transformative power of his own kindness, evidence of what grace can accomplish in a human heart when it's allowed to do its full work, proof that love, when it's genuine and persistent and unconditional, can create the kind of character that values relationship above everything else, that measures wealth in terms of connection rather than possession, that finds security in being known and loved rather than in owning and controlling. This was grace upon grace. The original grace that had lifted Mephibosheth from exile and seated him at the king's table, and now this second grace, this deeper grace, this grace that revealed itself not in the giving of gifts, but in the receiving of them, not in the restoration of fortune, but in the transcendence of fortune, not in getting what was deserved, but in discovering what was truly valuable. Mephibosheth had learned the secret that eludes so many people, that our circumstances don't determine our worth, that our security doesn't depend on our possessions, that our identity isn't defined by what we own, but by whose we are, that the most precious gifts can never be taken away because they live in the realm of relationship, in the space between hearts, in the bonds that connect souls. This is the ultimate message of Mephibosheth's story, that grace transforms not just our circumstances but our character, not just our position but our priorities, not just what we have but who we are, and that the greatest evidence of grace received is the ability to let go of everything else, confident that what matters most can never be lost, never be stolen, never be destroyed, because it lives in the realm where love rules, where mercy reigns, where grace has the final word. The exile was over, the relationship was restored, the table was waiting, and nothing else mattered at all.